Salt is on your skin right now. You do not notice it most of the time, but it is there, a thin layer left behind by sweat, by heat, by the simple fact of being alive. If you pressed your tongue to your wrist right now, you would taste it, that faint sharpness, that small sting. Salt, the ocean tastes like that. The same sharpness, the same small sting at the back of the throat, because the ocean is mostly water and salt. That is almost all it is. Your blood tastes like that too. If you have ever had a cut close to your mouth, you know, that thin, faint sharpness, that is salt. Your body carries it everywhere, in your blood, in your tears, in the fluid around every single cell. You cannot make salt yourself. Your body uses it every day, and every day it runs out, so you have to keep eating it, keep replacing it. This is not something that changed recently. This has been true since before humans existed. Every animal that has ever lived on land has needed salt, every one of them, and none of them could make it. They all had to go find it. That is the start of everything. Think of a very dry, flat piece of ground, somewhere open, after a long dry season, where a shallow lake used to be. The water is gone, but it left something behind, a white crust on the surface of the ground, thin as paper in some places, thick and hard in others. If you walked out onto it, it would crunch under your feet, small flat pieces breaking, the sound very quiet in all that open space. The light on it in the morning is almost too bright to look at. The white surface reflects everything. The whole flat goes pale and sharp in the early sun. But stand near it and you notice the smell first. Clean, almost nothing, just a faint sharpness in the air, not unpleasant, just very clean. Animals came to places like this, not just once. They came back again and again, following the same routes each time, because the body knows what it needs. And salt left a trace on the ground they could follow. Early humans followed them, not because they understood chemistry, not because they knew the word salt, just because the body recognized it. The taste said, "Come back here." That pull, that recognition, that is older than language, older than fire, older than anything we have a record of. There is nothing dramatic about salt on its own. A handful of it looks like small white stones, or like crushed glass, very small, slightly uneven, dull and flat light. If you hold it in your palm, it is cold at first, then it warms, and if you hold it long enough, the skin starts to dissolve it slightly. A faint sting, very faint, the kind you would miss if you were not paying attention. It does not look like something that shaped history. It looks like nothing, just small white crystals. But it was the first thing people traded, the reason certain roads were built, the reason certain cities exist at all. Wars were fought over it. Empires taxed it. Governments fell when they lost control of it. All of that comes later. Right now there is just this, the flat white ground, the early morning quiet, the body knowing without being told that this is something it needs. That is where it begins, before any of the history, before any names or dates or places, just the body, and the salt, and the ground it came from. Animals have been coming to these places for millions of years before the first human arrived. Worn paths in the earth, the same low ground visited over and over, where water once sat and then dried, and left something behind. The oldest paths on land follow salt. Some of them became roads. Some of those roads are still there. The first thing that needs to be said about salt and early humans is this: they did not choose it. Their bodies chose it for them. Long before anyone understood what salt was, the body was already pulling people toward it. The way hunger pulls you toward food, the way thirst pulls you toward water. Salt cravings work the same way. When your body is low on sodium, something shifts inside it. A signal, very quiet, but very clear. And before language, before tools, before fire, early humans were already following that signal. The places they followed it to were called salt licks. A salt lick is simply a place in the ground where salt naturally comes to the surface. It can be a rock with a salty coating, or a wet patch of ground where salty water seeps up from below, or the dried edge of a lake that used to hold salt water. Animals find these places: deer, elephants, buffalo. They come back to the same spots over and over. sometimes for thousands of years. The same ground, worn smooth by feet. The same rock, worn thin by tongues. Archaeologists have found these places. Some of them have bone layers going back hundreds of thousands of years. The same location visited again and again across deep time. Early humans followed the animals. That was how they hunted. And when they followed the animals to the salt, they tasted it too. And they came back. The paths that animals wore into the ground became paths humans walked. And some of those paths over a very long time became the first roads. Salt licks were the original destinations. Everything came later. At some point, early humans stopped just eating salt when they found it. They started carrying it. This is the moment that changes everything. When you carry something, it becomes a possession. When you have more than you need, you can give it away or trade it. And that is what happened. Salt was one of the very first things that moved between people who did not know each other. One group had access to a salt source. Another group did not. And the group without it would give something in exchange for it. Animal skins, flint, food. This is trade. And salt was doing this before metals were being used, before pottery was widespread, before most of the things we associate with early civilization. Salt moved between people before almost anything else did. We have evidence of this. In Romania, there is a site called Poiana Slatinei. It sits next to a natural salt spring. Salty water rises up from the ground there. And when archaeologists dug into the ground around that spring, they found something. Evidence of salt production going back 8,000 years. 6,000 years before the birth of Christ. People were coming to that spring, collecting the salty water and boiling it in clay pots. When the water evaporated, salt crystals were left behind. They were making salt, not just finding it, making it deliberately. The clay pots they used for this were found in huge numbers at the site. Thousands of them, broken and discarded, which tells you something important. They were not making small amounts for themselves, they were producing far more than one group could use, which means they were producing it to give away or to trade. 8,000 years ago, this site in Romania was already running what you would today call a production facility. Salt was that important. Salt does something else besides feeding the body. It preserves food. This discovery changed what was possible for early humans entirely. Before salt, if you killed an animal, you had to eat it quickly. In warm weather, meat begins to rot within a day or two. So a group could make a large kill, eat as much as they could, and then watch the rest spoil. Salt stopped that. When you pack meat in salt, or rub it into the surface, it draws the water out of the tissue. Bacteria need water to survive. Without water, they cannot grow. Without bacteria, the meat does not rot. It does not taste the same as fresh meat. It becomes harder, drier, and much saltier. But it stays safe to eat. For weeks, sometimes for months. Fish preserved in salt could survive a journey that fresh fish could not. Meat packed in salt could be stored through a winter. This was not a small thing. This was the ability to plan ahead, to store food during a good season and have something to eat during a bad one. Salt did not just feed people, it made it possible to survive seasons where food was scarce. It made longer journeys possible. It made trade over greater distances possible, because now you could carry food that would not spoil before you arrived. Salted fish moved inland from coasts. Salted meat moved between regions. Salt itself moved in every direction. By the time the first cities were forming, salt was already woven into the way people ate, stored, moved, and survived. It was not a luxury. It was a basic requirement, like water, like fire. And the people who controlled access to it had something very powerful, because everyone around them needed it, every single day. That kind of control does not stay quiet for long. Eventually, someone starts to write it down. Writing was invented in Mesopotamia, in the region that is now Iraq, around 5,000 years ago. The people there were called the Sumerians. They wrote on clay tablets using a system of marks pressed into soft clay with a reed. The clay was then dried or fired so it hardened, and those tablets survived. Many of them survived thousands of years buried in the ground, and when archaeologists dug them up and translated what was written on them, they found records, not poetry, not stories, records, lists of goods received, lists of goods sent out, accounts of what was owed and what was paid. Salt appears in these records. From the city of Uruk, around 3000 BC, there are administrative tablets that mention salt, not as something remarkable, as something routine. Salt being measured, salt being distributed, salt being accounted for, which tells you that by 5,000 years ago, salt was already being managed by a system. Someone was in charge of it. Someone was keeping track. This is one of the oldest bureaucratic mentions of salt in the entire world, and it shows up in the very earliest records of human writing. Not an afterthought, one of the first things organized enough to write down. The Sumerians also used salt in religious ceremonies. It appeared in purification rituals, in offerings to gods. Texts from this period describe salt as a substance that drove away evil, that cleansed a space, that made a place acceptable to a god. So within the first records of human writing, salt is already doing two things at once, being managed as a resource and being treated as something sacred, both things at the same time. In Egypt, salt had a use that no other civilization had discovered yet, or at least none that left a record. The Egyptians used it to preserve the dead. This is the mummification process, and salt was the thing that made it work. The specific salt they used was called natron. Natron is not table salt. It is a naturally occurring mixture of sodium compounds that forms in dried lake beds. Egypt had deposits of it in a place called Wadi el Natron, west of the Nile Delta. Dry white material that collects in the beds of lakes that have evaporated. The Egyptians harvested it and brought it back. When a person died and was going to be mummified, the body was washed and laid out. The internal organs were removed. The brain was removed through the nose using long, thin instruments. And then the body was packed in natron, covered completely, inside and out, and left for 40 days. The natron did the same thing to the body that salt does to meat. It pulled out the moisture. It dried the tissue. It stopped the body from decaying. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body was dried and light. Shrunken slightly, the skin pulled tight against the bone, then it was wrapped in linen, and it could last thousands of years. We know this because some of those mummies still exist. Egyptian mummies from 3,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago, are in museums today. You can see the skin, the hair, the features. All of that is possible because of salt. The Egyptians believed that the body needed to be preserved so the soul could return to it. So mummification was not just practical, it was religious. It was the most important thing you could do for someone after death. And at the center of that process, the thing that made it all work, the same substance was doing two completely opposite things in Egypt. Salt in food kept the living alive. Salt on the body kept the dead preserved. The salt that came through the markets fed people. The salt that came from Wadi el Natron went to the preparation rooms. Both kinds moved through the same city. Both were essential. Egypt was also one of the first places to tax salt. The pharaoh controlled the salt supply. The state controlled where it came from and who received it. Salt was distributed to workers as part of their pay. Workers building the pyramids received rations that included salt. It was not just food, it was a form of currency. Something the state gave out and something people depended on receiving. Control the salt and you control the people who need it. This is a lesson that every large civilization in history eventually learned. Egypt was learning it 4,000 years ago. Along the coast of Egypt, workers also extracted salt directly from the sea. Shallow pools were dug near the shore. Seawater was let in. Then the openings were blocked. The sun and the dry wind evaporated the water, and the salt was left behind in white crusts at the bottom of the pool. Workers scraped it up, piled it, loaded it. This process is called solar evaporation, and it is still how much of the world's salt is made today. The same basic method, 4,000 years later. There is something in that. A process simple enough to work the first time someone tried it, and still efficient enough that no one has needed to replace it. Sun, water, time, salt left behind. That is all it takes. And by the time Egypt's empire was at its peak, salt was moving across the ancient world in quantities that are hard to imagine now, not as something precious, as something ordinary, the most necessary ordinary thing in the world. Rome did not begin as an empire. It began as a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber River in what is now central Italy. A collection of villages on 7 hills, nothing particularly impressive about it at first, but it sat in exactly the right location, because not far from Rome where the Tiber meets the sea there were salt flats, shallow coastal wetlands where seawater collected and dried under the sun, leaving salt behind. This was the mouth of the Tiber, a place called Ostia. And for the early Romans, Ostia was not a port city or a trading hub. It was a salt works. That came first. The Romans dug channels to direct seawater into shallow holding pans. They built low walls to contain the water. They let the sun do the rest. And the salt that came out of those pans at Ostia was essential to everything the early Roman economy ran on. Preserving meat and fish, curing hides, keeping food through winter, feeding an army. The army needed salt badly, not just to eat, to preserve the food that traveled with it. An army that cannot keep its food from rotting cannot move far from its supply lines. Salt solved that. So very early in Rome's history, the state took control of the Ostia salt works. The government managed production, managed distribution, managed the price. Salt was not left to private merchants to handle however they liked. It was too important for that. And to move that salt from Ostia into Rome and beyond, they needed a road. So they built one, the Via Salaria, which in Latin means exactly what it sounds like, the Salt Road. It ran from the salt works at Ostia into Rome, and then northeast across the Italian peninsula, toward the Adriatic coast. And as Rome expanded, the Via Salaria became one of the most traveled roads in the ancient world, not because it was the most scenic, not because it connected famous cities, but because salt moved along it constantly, every day, in both directions. The road is still there. You can drive parts of it today in Italy, a modern road that follows the same route that salt carts rolled along 2,000 years ago. Rome eventually built over 400,000 kilometers of roads across its empire, some of the most sophisticated road engineering the ancient world ever produced. But the Salt Road was among the very first, built not for armies or trade in general, built specifically to move salt. That is how central salt was to what Rome was building, before the legions, before the aqueducts, before the forum and the temples and the courts. There was a road built to carry salt from the sea into the city. There is a word you use every day that comes from salt. The word is salary. It comes from the Latin word salarium, and salarium comes from sal, which is the Latin word for salt. The connection between salt and payment goes back a long way in Rome. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt directly, or they were given a specific allowance of money specifically to buy salt with. This allowance was called a salarium, and over time the word shifted. It came to mean payment in general, not just the salt portion, the whole thing. So when you receive a salary today, when you talk about what you earn, you are using a word whose root is a mineral, a word that started because Roman soldiers needed enough salt to stay alive and keep their food edible. That is how embedded salt was in Roman daily life, embedded enough to shape the language in a way that lasted 2,000 years. Salt also gave the Romans one of their most important food ingredients, a sauce called garum. Garum was made by packing fish very tightly with salt in large clay jars. The fish were left in those jars for months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes longer. The salt broke down the fish tissue completely, and what remained after the solids were strained out was a dark, intensely flavored liquid, very salty, very pungent, with a deep, rich taste that the Romans put on almost everything they ate. Garum was to Roman cooking what soy sauce is to parts of Asia today, a basic condiment, present at almost every meal, used across every level of society, from the poorest households to the tables of senators, and the entire garum industry depended entirely on salt. Without salt, the fish rotted instead of fermenting. The process did not work. Garum factories were large operations. They needed constant salt supply to keep working, and they were found across the Roman world, in Italy, in Spain, in North Africa, in what is now Portugal. Wherever Rome went, garum production followed, and wherever garum production followed, so did demand for salt. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder wrote about salt in the 1st century AD. He listed its uses carefully: medicine, preservation, food, ritual. He noted that no sacrifice to the gods could take place without salted grain being present. The ceremony required it. The priests prepared a mixture of salt and spelt flour called molla salsa, and sprinkled it on the animal before every religious sacrifice in Rome. This is where the English word immolate comes from, which means to sacrifice. Molla salsa was so central to the act of offering something to the gods that the word for the salt paste became the word for sacrifice itself. Salt was not on the edge of Roman religion. It was required at the center of it, at every altar, in every temple, without exception. As Rome expanded outward from Italy, salt became a weapon of political control. not a weapon you could hold in your hand. A quieter kind of weapon. When Rome conquered a new territory, one of the first things it did was take control of local salt production, or destroy it, or reroute it, so the new region depended on Rome for its supply. A population that needs salt from you is a population that cannot afford to fight you for very long. Cut the salt, and you cut the food preservation. Cut the food preservation, and you cut the army. Cut the army, and the rebellion ends. Roman historians recorded cases where salt supply was used as a form of punishment. A region that refused to comply could find its salt rations reduced or cut entirely. Not enough to kill people quickly, but enough to make daily life impossible to maintain. Enough to make compliance look like the better option. Rome also controlled salt prices tightly. At various points in Roman history, the price of salt was fixed by the state, not by the market. If the state decided salt cost a certain amount, that was what it cost, and the state could raise that price whenever it needed more revenue, or lower it to keep a restless population calm. Salt pricing was a governing tool, used the way modern governments use interest rates or fuel subsidies. Adjust it, and you adjust the daily reality of millions of people simultaneously. Rome also taxed salt. The tax was called the salinae, and it brought in substantial revenue, because everyone paid it. The poor and the rich both needed salt, both had to buy it, both paid the tax. A tax on salt hits everyone equally in that way. It is one of the most efficient forms of taxation a state can run, because the demand never disappears. People cannot simply choose not to buy salt, the way they might choose not to buy wine or cloth. Salt is not optional, and so the revenue it generates is predictable, constant, year after year. The Roman state understood this very clearly, and every empire that came after Rome understood it too. There were also Roman salt works far beyond Ostia by the time the empire was at its peak. Salt came from mines in what is now Austria, from coastal operations in Spain and North Africa, from salt pans along the coast of what is now France. The supply network was enormous, and all of it fed into the same system, controlled by the state, taxed by the state, priced by the state. One of the largest administrative systems Rome ever ran was built around a single mineral. When the Roman Empire eventually collapsed in the 5th century, the salt infrastructure did not collapse with it. The salt works were still there. The knowledge of how to run them was still there. The local populations who had depended on those systems for generations were still there. They just no longer sent the revenue to Rome. They kept it, and over the following centuries, whoever controlled those salt works in each region became powerful, because the same logic held. Control the salt, and you control the people who need it. That logic did not belong to Rome. Rome just used it very well. On the other side of the world, at roughly the same period in history, China was doing something Rome had not yet thought of. China was building a state monopoly on salt. Not just controlling it, not just taxing it, owning the entire process from production to sale. The Chinese salt monopoly is one of the oldest government monopolies in recorded history. Its roots go back to the 7th century BC, to a statesman named Guanzhong, who served the state of Qi in what is now northeastern China. Guanzhong looked at the salt trade and saw something very clear. Salt was not like other goods. You did not buy it when you felt like it and skip it when you didn't. You bought it constantly, every household, every month, every year. So he proposed to the ruler of Qi that the state take control of all salt production in the region, end private salt trading, and use the revenue to fund the government. The ruler agreed, and the result was an immediate and enormous increase in state income. Qi became one of the most powerful states in China within a generation, not because of military conquest, because of salt revenue. Other Chinese states watched this and did the same. By the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 200 years BC, the salt monopoly was a central pillar of how China was financed. The government controlled where salt could be produced, who was licensed to make it, who could transport it, who could sell it, at what price. Every step of the process was regulated, and the revenue flowed into the imperial treasury. Chinese salt production at this scale was a massive operation. Along the eastern coast, enormous salt fields were carved out of the coastline, shallow pans dug into the earth, seawater channeled in through a system of gates and trenches. Then the sun and wind did the work. In the interior of China, where the sea was too far away, there were salt lakes, high plateau regions where ancient inland seas had dried and left behind vast deposits of salt. Workers went out onto the surface of these lakes in flat-bottomed boats and scraped the salt directly off the water's crust. The crust formed continuously as water evaporated, and new salt crystallized on the surface, so the harvest never stopped. In Sichuan province, workers discovered something else entirely: underground brine. Salty water trapped deep below the earth in rock formations. They drilled down to reach it, using bamboo pipe sections fitted together into long tubes. Some of these early wells went down over 100 meters, drilled by hand, by workers turning a weighted drill bit for hours at a time. The brine was hauled up in buckets, then boiled in iron pans to evaporate the water and leave the salt. Some of those Sichuan wells also release natural gas from the rock formations below, and Chinese workers discovered they could pipe that gas up through bamboo tubes and use it to fuel the fires under the boiling pans. This was happening over 1,000 years before natural gas was used as fuel anywhere else in the world. Salt production drove that discovery. The need to boil brine as efficiently as possible pushed workers to find a better fuel source, and they found one under their feet. The salt monopoly in China did not stay as a simple revenue stream for long. It became the foundation of how the Chinese state was organized. Managing salt production and distribution across a country as large and varied as China required an enormous amount of administration. You needed officials to oversee production in each region, officials to manage transport, officials to track sales, officials to collect the tax, officials to catch people selling salt without a license, officials to oversee the officials. What grew up around the salt trade was one of the most elaborate bureaucratic systems in the ancient world. A layered structure of government officials with specific roles, specific jurisdictions, and specific accountability. And historians who study early Chinese government have noted that this salt administration was essentially the model for all the bureaucratic systems that came after it. The way officials were appointed, the way records were kept, the way inspections were conducted, all of it was developed and refined first around the management of salt, then applied to everything else. Salt taught China how to administer itself at scale, and the money it generated paid for things that are still remarkable today. The Great Wall of China is one of the largest construction projects in human history. Thousands of kilometers of wall across mountains and desert, built to keep northern nomadic peoples from raiding Chinese settlements. The building of the wall required workers in enormous numbers, hundreds of thousands of laborers across centuries of construction. It required materials: stone, brick, timber, mortar. It required food for all those workers, and it required money to organize and pay for all of it. Much of that money came from salt revenue. The salt tax funded military campaigns. It funded the construction of canals. It funded government salaries and the running of courts and the maintenance of roads. For most of Chinese imperial history, salt revenue was between a third and a half of all government income. The empire could not have functioned without it. Salt smuggling was a serious crime in China for exactly this reason. If people bought illegal salt instead of the state's salt, the government lost income it could not afford to lose. Smugglers were executed when caught, and yet smuggling persisted throughout Chinese history. Because the state salt was taxed, its price was always higher than what a smuggler could charge. The poor, who spent a larger portion of their income on food basics, were the ones most tempted by cheaper illegal salt. This created a permanent tension inside the Chinese salt system, but the high price pushed people toward the black market, which reduced the revenue, which pushed the government to raise the price further to compensate, which pushed more people toward the black market. Chinese governments wrestled with this cycle for over 2,000 years, and the salt smugglers who operated in that gap between the official price and the real price became powerful figures. Some of them built private armies, some of them funded rebellions. One of the most significant peasant uprisings in Chinese history, in the late Tang dynasty around 875 AD, was led by a man named Huang Chao. Huang Chao was a salt smuggler. He had grown rich in the illegal salt trade and used that wealth to raise an army that came close to destroying the Tang dynasty entirely. A salt smuggler nearly ended one of the greatest dynasties in Chinese history. That tells you how much money was moving through the illegal salt trade and how deep a role salt played in Chinese political life. There is something that almost every major religion in the ancient world has in common. Salt appears in all of them, not because the religions borrowed from each other. Many of them had no contact with each other at all. Salt appears in their rituals and texts independently, which means different peoples on different continents in different centuries all arrived at the same conclusion: that salt was not just a food, that it meant something more than that. In the Hebrew Bible, salt appears throughout. There is a specific phrase repeated in several places, the covenant of salt. A covenant of salt was an agreement that could not be broken, the most permanent and binding kind of promise, because salt does not rot. It does not change. It does not decay. And a covenant made with salt was understood to carry that same permanence. The book of Numbers states that offerings to God must be seasoned with salt. The book of Leviticus says that every grain offering presented to God must have salt with it, and that the salt of the covenant must never be left out. This was not a suggestion. It was a requirement. Jewish religious law, which developed from these texts, carried the salt requirement forward. To this day, in traditional Jewish practice, bread eaten on the Sabbath is dipped in salt, and meat prepared according to kosher law is salted as part of the process of making it acceptable. The salt requirement from those ancient texts is still present in everyday practice thousands of years later. The story of Lot's wife in the book of Genesis describes a woman who looks back at the burning city of Sodom and is turned into a pillar of salt. The exact meaning of this image has been discussed for a very long time, but the fact that salt was chosen as the substance of her transformation, not stone, not wood, not ash, says something about how central salt was to the way that culture understood permanence and punishment simultaneously. In Buddhist tradition, salt is used in purification ceremonies. In Japan, which has a deep connection to Buddhist and Shinto practice, salt is thrown at the entrance of a home after a funeral, to purify the space, to push away what should not linger. Sumo wrestlers throw salt into the ring before a match for the same reason. The ring is sacred ground during the contest, and salt purifies it before they enter. In Shinto shrines across Japan today, small piles of salt are left at the entrance, a practice that has continued without interruption for well over 1,000 years. In Hindu rituals, salt is used in ceremonies marking transitions, birth, marriage, death. Salt is present at the moments when ordinary life crosses into something else, when the normal rules are briefly suspended and something larger is being marked. In ancient Greece, salt was included in offerings to the gods alongside grain and wine. The word for these offerings included salt so consistently that the Greek word for sacrifice was sometimes used interchangeably with the phrase that meant to offer salt. What connects all of these is not coincidence, it is the logic of salt itself. Salt preserves. Salt does not change. Salt purifies by stopping the process of decay. Every culture that understood what salt did to food eventually extended that logic to the sacred. If salt keeps meat from rotting, if salt keeps a promise from fading, then salt belongs near anything that is meant to last, near gods, near the dead, near the moments that are supposed to mean something permanent. The same logic, reached independently, on every continent where salt was known. The Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert on Earth. It covers most of northern Africa, roughly the size of the United States. And for most of its surface, it is one of the least hospitable places a person can be. Extreme heat during the day, very cold at night, almost no water, no shade, no food, long stretches of nothing in every direction. And yet for over 1,000 years, camel caravans crossed it regularly, back and forth, season after season, carrying one thing north and a different thing south, because on each side of the Sahara, there was something the other side desperately needed. In the south, below the desert, there was gold. The kingdoms of West Africa sat on top of some of the richest gold deposits in the world. Rivers running through the region carried gold dust. Whole communities built their lives around mining and processing it. But gold, for all its value, cannot keep you alive. You cannot eat it. And the kingdoms of the south had a serious problem. They had almost no salt. The land did not produce it, the rivers did not carry it, and without salt, food could not be preserved. Meat spoiled quickly in the heat. Fish caught from rivers had to be eaten within hours or thrown away. Salt was not a luxury in West Africa, it was a survival problem. And in the north, above the desert, the situation was reversed. There was no shortage of salt in the Sahara itself. In the middle of the desert, in a place called Tagaza, there were vast deposits of rock salt just below the surface, so close to the surface that the buildings in Tagaza were constructed from blocks of it. The walls of the houses were salt, the roofs were supported by salt beams, the floors were salt. Everything in Tagaza was built from the one material that happened to be lying everywhere underfoot. But the people of the north had almost no gold, so the trade was obvious. One side had what the other side lacked, and the Sahara, as impossible as it seemed, was the road between them. Merchants organized caravans, sometimes thousands of camels at a time, moving in long lines across the desert, each camel carrying salt slabs cut from the mines at Tagaza, each slab roughly a meter long and heavy. 2 slabs per camel was the usual load. The caravans moved slowly, they had to. The desert crossing from Tagaza to the markets of the south took weeks, sometimes over a month. Water was carried in animal skin bags, rationed carefully, because there were stretches of 5 days or more with no water source at all. If the caravan ran short, people died. This happened, not rarely. The desert crossing was genuinely dangerous every single time, because the profit on the other side was large enough to justify the risk. Salt sold in the markets of the south for extraordinary prices. At the peak of the trade, in some markets, salt was exchanged weight for weight against gold. The same weight of salt and gold traded directly for each other. That is how scarce salt was south of the Sahara, and that is how valuable the caravan routes were to everyone who ran them. The city of Timbuktu sits at the edge of the Sahara, in what is now the country of Mali. Today it is a small, dry, remote place. Most people who have heard of it think of it as a symbol of somewhere far away and forgotten. The phrase "at the ends of the earth." But in the 14th century, Timbuktu was one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the world, a crossing point, where the salt caravans coming from the north met the gold caravans coming from the south, and the exchange happened. Timbuktu was not just a market, it was a center of Islamic scholarship. It had universities, libraries, mosques of remarkable size and quality. Scholars from across the Islamic world traveled there to study, and all of that, the buildings and the books and the scholars, was paid for by trade, and the trade was built on salt and gold moving in opposite directions across the desert. The empire that controlled Timbuktu during its peak was the Mali Empire. Mali at its height covered an enormous area of West Africa, stretching from the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east. It was one of the largest empires on earth at the time, and its wealth came from controlling the trade routes. The Mali emperors did not mine the gold themselves in most cases, and they did not mine the salt themselves. They taxed everything that moved. Every caravan that entered Mali paid a tax on arrival. Every caravan that left paid a tax on departure. Salt coming in was taxed. Gold going out was taxed. The goods themselves were taxed again when they changed hands inside the market. The Mali state sat at the center of the flow and took a portion of everything. The most famous ruler of the Mali Empire was a man named Mansa Musa. He ruled in the early 14th century, and in 1324 he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, which was a journey that rulers of the Islamic faith were expected to undertake at least once in their lives. Mansa Musa traveled with a caravan of approximately 60,000 people, including soldiers, servants, scholars, and enslaved people. And he brought so much gold with him that when he passed through Egypt and spent freely in the markets there, he caused a collapse in the local price of gold. So much gold entered the Egyptian economy during his visit that gold became less scarce and therefore less valuable. The price of gold in Egypt did not recover for over a decade. One man's pilgrimage disrupted an entire regional economy. That is the scale of wealth the Mali Empire had accumulated, and that wealth came from the trade routes, which came from the control of where salt and gold crossed paths. The caravan routes through the Sahara were not random wanderings across open desert. They were fixed paths, known to the merchants who ran them, mapped by where the water sources were, where shelter could be found in the form of rocky outcrops or dry valleys, where the ground was firm enough for camels to walk on without sinking. And who controlled the wells along those routes, controlled the routes themselves, because a caravan that cannot water its animals cannot move. The Mali state invested in maintaining those wells, which made them indispensable to the merchants, which kept the tax revenue flowing. Salt built this empire the same way salt built Rome, and the same way salt financed China, by being the one thing that everyone needed, and no one could do without. The workers who actually cut the salt at Tagaza lived in conditions that are difficult to describe without making them sound worse than they were. But they were not good. Tagaza itself had no food. Nothing grew there. The ground was salt and sand and rock. Everything that the workers ate had to be carried in from outside, which meant that the merchants who ran the caravans also controlled the food supply of the people who mined the salt. Workers at Tagaza ate what arrived on the next caravan. and if the caravan was late or if the season was bad, they waited. The work itself was hard and slow. The rock salt was close to the surface, which made it accessible, but it had to be cut into usable slabs by hand, using iron tools, in heat that averaged well above 40 degrees Celsius during the day. The slabs were cut to a standard size so that each camel could carry a known weight. This standardization mattered enormously, because when the salt arrived at a distant market, buyers needed to know what they were getting. A Taghaza slab of salt had a known size and a known weight. It could be traded as a unit, the way you might trade a coin. In some markets south of the Sahara, the salt slabs themselves functioned as currency, not just as goods to be exchanged for currency, as currency itself. People paid for things with pieces of salt slab, broke off a portion from a block, the way you might break a piece from a bar of something valuable. And that portion was accepted as payment. Salt was money. Physical, portable, universally needed money. The Arab traveler and scholar Ibn Battuta crossed the Sahara in 1352 and wrote about the journey in detail. He described the caravan leaving the city of Sijil Massa in Morocco and traveling south into the desert. He wrote about the crossing carefully, the days without water, the discomfort of the heat, the size of the caravan, which he estimated at 12,000 camels. He wrote about arriving at Taghaza and finding a place with no shade, no beauty, no attraction of any kind. Nothing except salt, and the constant movement of people cutting it, loading it, and preparing to carry it south. He noted that despite the misery of the place, it generated enormous wealth for everyone involved in the trade chain, from the workers cutting the slabs, to the merchants who transported them, to the rulers who taxed the exchange. Everyone profited from the salt, except perhaps the workers at Taghaza itself, who saw very little of the money that moved because of their labor. Ibn Battuta eventually reached Timbuktu and wrote about that too. He described its mosques and its markets, its scholars and its merchants. And he wrote that the city was full of books, which were the most valued commodity traded there, more valued even than gold or salt. Books were imported from North Africa and sold for high prices, which tells you something remarkable about Timbuktu, that a city built on the salt and gold trade had enough surplus wealth to develop a market for scholarship. When you have solved your survival problems completely enough, you start spending on knowledge. Salt made that possible in West Africa, the same way it made bureaucracy possible in China, and roads possible in Rome, and the capacity to preserve the dead possible in Egypt. Salt keeps appearing at the base of every large thing people build. Venice is a city built on water, a group of small islands in a shallow lagoon on the northeastern coast of Italy. The water between the islands is not deep, in most places only a few meters. And for most of human history, a lagoon like that was not considered valuable land. It was too wet to farm, too shallow for large ships, too exposed to be easily defended. But that lagoon had one thing: tidal flats. Shallow areas where seawater washed in and then receded. And in those tidal flats, salt collected naturally as the water dried. The earliest settlers on those islands discovered very quickly that they were sitting on top of a salt-producing environment, and they began to harvest it. The technique was the same one Egypt had used thousands of years earlier. Channel the seawater into shallow holding pans, let the sun evaporate it, scrape up the salt that remains. But Venice refined this process carefully. They built an elaborate system of channels, gates, and pans across the lagoon, controlling exactly how much water entered each pan, when it entered, how long it sat before the next stage. The process had multiple stages. Water moved through a series of increasingly concentrated pans, getting saltier at each stage as water evaporated. By the time it reached the final pan, it was almost entirely saturated with salt, and what crystallized out was very pure. This was not accidental. It was managed by workers who understood the process well and maintained it through every season. Venice began selling this salt to nearby cities on the Italian mainland in the early medieval period, first locally, then further, then across the Adriatic to the Western Balkans. And very quickly the Venetian leaders realized something about this trade, that if they could control not just their own salt production, but the salt supply across the entire region, they would have power far beyond what their small island city should have been able to hold. So Venice made a deliberate and calculated decision. It would not simply sell salt. It would become the only place that sold salt. Every ship that moved salt through the northern Adriatic had to pass through Venice. Venice required this by law. Any salt merchant who tried to bypass Venice and sell directly was considered a smuggler and treated accordingly. The Venetian state built a fleet specifically to enforce this. Armed galleys that patrolled the Adriatic and boarded any vessel suspected of carrying salt without Venetian authorization. This was not negotiation. This was enforcement at sea. And it worked. Venice became the salt broker for the entire northern Mediterranean, not because it produced the most salt in the world, but because it controlled who could sell it and who could buy it. The income from this was enormous, and Venice used that income to build something remarkable, a trading empire that stretched across the Mediterranean, with ports and warehouses and offices from Alexandria in Egypt to Constantinople in what is now Turkey, a city of 100,000 people on a group of small islands in a shallow lagoon. One of the most powerful states in Europe for 400 years, built on salt. Venice did not only control salt by force, it also controlled it by deliberate destruction. Any city or region within Venice's sphere of influence that had its own salt production was a threat, because a city that makes its own salt does not need to buy from Venice. And a city that does not need to buy from Venice has no reason to cooperate with Venice. So Venice worked systematically to eliminate competitor salt works across the region, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through economic pressure, and sometimes by physically destroying the infrastructure. There are documented cases in which Venice deliberately flooded the salt pans of competing cities, by manipulating water channels or simply breaking the barriers that kept seawater at the right level in the evaporation pans. If you flood a salt pan at the wrong time, the carefully concentrated brine dilutes, the stages of evaporation are reset, the entire season's work is destroyed, and the workers who depended on that production are left with nothing to sell. Venice did this not once but repeatedly, as a deliberate tactic, not out of cruelty, but out of economics. The goal was to make competitor salt production unprofitable or impossible, so that the only reliable source of salt in the region remained Venice. Venice also used salt as a political lever with its trading partners. Cities on the Italian mainland that cooperated with Venice got salt at favorable prices. Cities that resisted or allied with Venice's enemies found their salt supplies interrupted or repriced sharply. Salt was not just an item Venice sold, it was an instrument of foreign policy. Venice also sourced salt from regions far beyond its own lagoon. It purchased salt from producers in what is now Cyprus, from the island of Crete, from salt works along the Dalmatian coast, and then resold it at a markup, having added nothing to the product except its position in the middle of the transaction. This is what a trading empire does. It inserts itself between producers and buyers and extracts value from the position. Venice was very good at this. The salt office in Venice, called the Officium Salis, was one of the most powerful government departments in the city. It decided where salt could be bought and sold within Venetian territory, at what prices, in what quantities, which merchants had licenses, which routes were permitted. The records of the Officium Salis from the 13th and 14th centuries still exist in Venetian archives. Thousands of documents, detailing prices, volumes, licenses, disputes, and punishments for violations. An entire government department devoted to one mineral. The salt trade funded the Venetian navy, which protected the salt trade, which funded the navy. The loop was self-reinforcing, and it ran for centuries. When Venetian merchants brought back spices from Asia after the 13th century, when they established cloth trade routes to northern Europe, when they built their glass industry on the island of Murano, all of that diversification was paid for initially by salt revenue. Salt was the first and most essential Venetian commodity. Everything else came later. Everything else was built on top of it. The palaces on the Grand Canal, the domes of the churches, the libraries and the painting studios and the printing presses that Venice became famous for. All of it traces back, at its foundation, to salt harvested from a shallow lagoon. The influence of Venice on salt trade spread something across medieval Europe that outlasted the Venetian Empire itself. A model of salt taxation that other states adopted and built on. The most famous version of this was the gabelle, the salt tax of France. France introduced its salt tax in the 14th century, and it became one of the most hated laws in French history. The gabelle required every person above a certain age to buy a minimum amount of salt each year, not just to pay a tax on salt they chose to buy, but to purchase a fixed quantity of state salt whether they needed it or not. This minimum purchase was called the devoir de sel, the salt duty. The state decided how much salt you were required to own, and you paid for it regardless of your circumstances. The price of this compulsory salt was set by the state, and was not fixed evenly across France. Different regions paid wildly different prices for the same salt. A family in one province might pay 8 times the price for the same amount of salt as a family in a neighboring province. This was not an accident, it was by design. The French crown gave certain regions lower salt prices as a privilege, as a reward for political loyalty, or as a concession made during negotiations over territory, and it charged other regions more as a way of extracting revenue from areas that had fewer political protections. The poor were the ones who suffered most under the gabelle, because salt consumed a much larger portion of a poor family's income than a wealthy family's. A salt tax at a flat rate is effectively a higher burden on people with less money. And the gabelle was not even a flat rate. It was a compulsory purchase at a price the state set unilaterally. Salt smuggling in France became widespread for exactly this reason. Smugglers brought salt in from regions with lower prices and sold it in regions where the state price was very high. The profit was significant enough that people took serious risks to do it. The penalties for salt smuggling in France were severe. First offense, a large fine. Repeat offense, physical punishment. For those who carried weapons while smuggling, death. The enforcement was carried out by a dedicated force of government agents called the gabellas, who patrolled the roads and borders between salt regions, checking wagons and boats for illegal salt. The French population despised them, and despised the gabelle itself. When historians list the grievances that built toward the French Revolution in 1789, the gabelle is always on that list. It was explicitly abolished by the revolutionary government in 1790, one of the first acts of the new legislature. The crowd cheered when it was announced. A 400-year-old salt tax ended in a single vote, though France brought a version of it back under Napoleon a few years later, because the state still needed the revenue. That is the nature of salt taxation. Governments know it is unfair. They know people hate it, and they keep doing it anyway, because the money it generates is too consistent and too large to walk away from. Salt taxation in France formally ended in 1945, over 600 years after it began. In 1248, miners began digging into a hillside near the town of Krakow, in what is now southern Poland. They were looking for rock salt. They found it, and they kept digging. What they created over the following 700 years is one of the most extraordinary places made by human hands anywhere on Earth, the Wieliczka salt mine. By the time mining activity in its original form ended in the 20th century, the mine had over 300 kilometers of tunnels, spread across 9 levels, reaching down nearly 330 meters below the surface. The deepest parts of it are as far below ground as a tall skyscraper is above it, and almost every surface down there is salt. The walls are salt, the floors are salt. In places where the salt contains different minerals, the walls have color: pale gray, blue-green, brownish with veins of white running through the darker sections like rivers on a map. The earliest miners at Wieliczka worked in the shallowest deposits, close to the surface, with hand tools, iron picks and wooden wedges. They broke the rock salt into chunks small enough to lift, then carried those chunks up ladders to the surface. It was cold down there. The temperature underground stays around 13 or 14 degrees Celsius year-round. Comfortable enough at first, but after hours of hard physical work in the dark, cold and damp, the body cools quickly when it stops moving. Miners worked by the light of tallow candles, small flames in a very large darkness. The tunnels in the early centuries were narrow, just wide enough for a person to move through, low in places. The miners learned the layout of their section of the mine the way you learn a house you have lived in for years, by feel as much as sight, by memory of where the ceiling dipped and where the ground was uneven. The mine was dangerous in the ways that underground work has always been dangerous. Tunnel collapse was the most feared risk. The salt is soft enough to work with hand tools, which made mining possible, but hard enough to hold its shape in large chambers, which made it survivable. Over time, the miners developed systems of wooden support beams to hold up the roofs of chambers where the salt had been removed. Some of those chambers were very large, rooms carved entirely out of salt, tens of meters across and 10 or 15 meters high, emptied by generations of work. The wood they used for support beams eventually absorbed salt from the air around it, which is one reason some of those ancient wooden structures survived. Salt preserved the wood the same way it preserved meat. Some of the original timber support structures at Wieliczka, installed in the 13th and 14th centuries, were still intact when modern engineers examined them. 700 years of preservation. By the mineral the miners were there to extract, Wieliczka was not only a mine. From very early in its history, it was also an economic engine for the Polish state. Salt from Wieliczka was one of the primary sources of revenue for the Polish crown for several centuries. At the height of its output in the 16th century, Wieliczka and its neighboring mine at Bochnia together produced roughly a third of Poland's total state income. 1/3 of everything the Polish government had to spend came from these two mines, from underground, carried up in chunks by men with candles. Something unusual happened in the Wieliczka mine that did not happen in most other mines in the world. The miners began to carve things, not as decoration added later, but as part of living in the mine. Miners who spent most of their waking hours underground, deep inside the earth, surrounded by salt walls in every direction, started shaping that salt into figures and rooms and eventually whole spaces with a specific purpose. The first carvings were religious, small figures of saints carved directly into the salt walls at tunnel junctions, places where a miner would pass several times during a shift, a place to make a small prayer before a difficult section of work, to acknowledge the danger, to ask for protection. This was practical religion, not art for its own sake, but something between a habit and a need. Over time, those small carvings grew into larger figures, into relief panels set into the walls, showing scenes from the Bible or from Polish history, and eventually into full underground chapels. The Chapel of St. Kinga is the most famous of these, carved entirely from salt, every surface of it. It is 54 meters long, 12 meters wide, and 12 meters high, a space the size of a large church, cut into the rock salt at a depth of 101 meters below the Earth's surface. The floor is salt, carved to look like stone tiles. The walls have relief carvings of scenes from the New Testament, made by miners working in their own time, with tools they also used for mining. The altar is salt. The figures on the altar are salt. The chandeliers overhead are made from salt crystals. When a candle is placed near those crystals, the light diffracts through them, and the whole room shifts slightly, a faint glitter moving across the salt walls, quiet and slow. The carving of this chapel was not a single project completed in a few years. It was worked on across decades by generations of miners, each generation adding to what the last left behind. Some of the relief panels were carved in the 17th century, others in the 18th, others in the 19th. The chapel grew slowly, the way a coral reef grows, one small addition at a time, over a very long period. Today the chapel is fully operational. Services are held there regularly. Weddings take place in it, 100 meters below the surface of the earth, in a room carved from salt, by men who spent their lives underground. The mine also has an underground lake. In one of the lower chambers, the groundwater that seeped in over centuries was not pumped out, but left in place. It formed a still lake at the bottom of a large salt chamber. The salt walls reflect in it. It is completely silent down there, except for the occasional drip from the ceiling. Visitors to the mine today can take a boat across this lake, in the dark, with the salt walls on every side, at a depth that would put them at the base of a 30-story building if they were above ground. The lake has been there for centuries, still, cold, saying nothing. A miner at Wieliczka in the 14th century began his working day before sunrise. He would descend into the mine through a shaft, not a modern elevator, a wooden platform lowered by a rope wound around a horizontal drum, turned by horses walking in a circle on the surface above. The descent took several minutes. The light from above faded quickly. After the first 20 or 30 meters, the opening above was just a pale circle, and then only darkness. At the bottom, he would collect his candle from a supply point, a small tallow candle, set in a holder he clipped to his belt or his hat. And he would walk to his section of the mine. Sometimes that walk was short. Sometimes it took 20 minutes or more through winding tunnels. His tools were an iron pick and a wooden mallet. He would chip at the salt face in front of him, breaking off chunks, loading them into a wooden cart or a leather bag, depending on the size of the tunnel. The work was repetitive, the same motion, thousands of times across a shift. The sound of it was a constant dry crack and crumble. Salt does not ring out like stone or metal. It breaks with a duller sound, almost soft. His shift lasted roughly 8 hours, with a short break somewhere in the middle to eat whatever he had brought with him. Bread, usually, perhaps some dried meat, eaten in the dark, sitting against a salt wall, with the candle guttering beside him. The air in the mine was not bad by the standards of other underground work. Salt mines do not produce the coal dust or the toxic gases that made coal mining so deadly. The air was dry and very slightly salty in taste. Miners at Wieliczka had notably better respiratory health than miners in other industries, a fact that people began to notice and investigate in later centuries. In the 19th century, a Polish physician named Felix Boczkowski documented that Wieliczka miners did not suffer the lung diseases common to other miners, and he suggested that the salty air was protective. He was right. Halotherapy, the medical use of salt air for respiratory conditions, traces its formal origins to that observation at Wieliczka. Today, the lower levels of the mine are used as a treatment facility for people with asthma and other breathing conditions. Patients stay in rooms carved from salt for extended periods, breathing air that has not changed much since the medieval miners worked there. The miner in the 14th century did not know any of this. He knew the shift, the dark, the weight of the pick, the sound of salt breaking, the walk back to the shaft at the end of the day, the slow ascent toward the pale circle of light above, and the surface, but always bright after the underground. He would have done that descent and ascent 5 or 6 days a week, for most of his adult life, as his father did before him, and as his sons would after him. Mining families at Wieliczka worked the same mine across generations. The same tunnels, extended deeper and further each decade, the mine growing around and below and ahead of them, salt extracted one shift at a time for 700 years. In the northwest of England, in a flat, quiet county called Cheshire, the ground is full of salt. Not rock salt close to the surface the way it was at Taghaza. Something different. Deep underground, far below the fields and the farmhouses and the rivers, there are enormous deposits of rock salt left over from an ancient sea. A sea that covered this part of Britain roughly 220 million years ago. That sea evaporated slowly over an immense span of time, and as it did, it left its salt behind, buried, sealed under layers of sediment, waiting. The people who eventually settled in Cheshire discovered this long before anyone knew what was actually underground. What they found first was the water. In certain places across the Cheshire Plain, the groundwater that seeped down through the rock and came back up as springs was heavy with dissolved salt. Briny, not drinkable, but useful. If you boiled that water in a wide, shallow pan, the water evaporated and the salt was left behind. This had been done in Cheshire since before the Romans arrived. There is evidence of salt production in the area going back over 4,000 years. The Romans recognized the value of the region immediately. They built a settlement called Condat where the town of Northwich stands today, and they extracted brine from the ground and boiled it in large clay containers over open fires. The salt went into the Roman supply chain, moving east and south along the roads the Romans were building across Britain. After the Romans left, the work continued. Different rulers, different languages, different centuries, but the same pans, the same brine, the same fire underneath. The names of the Cheshire towns carry the history in their endings. In Old English, the word for a brine spring or a salt working place was wick. Over time, this became witch. Northwich, Middlewich, Nantwich. 3 towns a few miles apart, all named for the same thing. All of them built on the same underground resource. All of them producing salt for the surrounding region for century after century after century. In 1670, something changed. Workers drilling for coal near a village called Marbury struck something unexpected. Not coal, a solid layer of rock salt at a depth of around 30 meters. This was not brine that needed to be pumped up and evaporated. This was solid salt already in the ground. The discovery changed everything about how Cheshire produced salt. Within a few years, entrepreneurs were sinking shafts to reach the rock salt directly, cutting it out in blocks, lifting it to the surface, or, more commonly, dissolving it by pumping water down into the deposits. The water would dissolve the salt underground and be pumped back up as concentrated brine, much stronger than the natural brine springs, easier to evaporate, producing more salt per pan per day than the old methods ever had. The industry grew quickly. Through the 18th century and into the 19th, Cheshire became the most productive salt-making region in the world. Canal networks were built specifically to move the salt out. The Weaver navigation, a system of locks and improved waterways, was engineered almost entirely to carry Cheshire salt north and west to the coast. From there, it went to Liverpool and then onto ships, to Ireland, to America, to the fisheries of Newfoundland, where it was used to preserve the cod catches. The cod fisheries of the North Atlantic ran on Cheshire salt. A material pulled from the ground in a flat English county ended up in the holds of fishing boats crossing the Atlantic, preserving fish that would feed people on 3 continents. The distances involved, the connections between one place and another, are easy to miss when you are only looking at a salt pan. The problem with pumping brine from underground in the way Cheshire's salt industry learned to do it was one that nobody fully understood until the damage was already done. When you dissolve the rock salt underground and pump the brine to the surface, you are removing material from below. Solid material, tons of it, every day. And when enough material is removed from below, the ground above has nothing to rest on. It settles, it cracks, it sinks. This process was called subsidence, and in Cheshire during the peak of the industrial salt era, it was happening constantly. The early operators of the brine pumps were working what became known as wild brine. This meant pumping from wherever the brine was richest without any systematic plan for what the pumping would do to the ground above. The idea was simply to extract as much as possible, as quickly as possible. The consequences were somebody else's problem. And the consequences were extraordinary. Streets in Northwich began to crack, houses tilted, church towers developed visible lean. In places where the underground dissolution was especially rapid, buildings did not just tilt, they sank, whole structures dropping several feet into the ground, sometimes overnight, sometimes over the course of a week. A building that stood at street level in the morning might have its ground floor windows below street level by the following spring. This happened not once or twice, but repeatedly, across the affected areas of Cheshire throughout the 19th century. The townspeople of Northwich adapted. Many of the buildings in the town center were built on wooden frames that could be jacked up as the ground subsided beneath them. When the ground dropped, the owner would hire men to raise the building back to street level. Wooden wedges, iron jacks, teams working from the foundations, lifting a house that had sunk. This was considered a normal part of life in Northwich for much of the Victorian era. The more damaging effect was what happened to the landscape itself. In places where the subsidence was especially deep, the land did not just crack and drop, it flooded. Because the ground below, once dissolved of its salt, was left as hollow cavern, and hollow caverns beneath flat land eventually collapse. And when they collapse and the ground is near water, the collapsed hollow fills with it. These flooded subsidence zones became lakes. The people of Cheshire called them flashes. They appeared without warning. Fields became ponds overnight. Stretches of farmland that had been growing crops the previous season were underwater the next. Bridges dropped into the new water. Roads ended at the edge of fresh lakes that had not existed 6 months before. Some of those flashes are still there today. You can walk past them in Cheshire, and they look like natural features of the landscape. Small, quiet pools surrounded by reeds, ducks sitting on them. But they are industrial scars, evidence of what the salt industry did to the ground it drew from. The same story as everywhere else in this history. Extraction on a large scale always leaves a mark on the place it happens. The Saharan desert had towns built from the salt taken out of it. The Polish ground had tunnels and chapels cut into it. The Cheshire Plain has lakes where fields used to be. The mark changes shape, but the principle is the same. You take something out of the ground, and the ground changes around the absence. In Cheshire, the absence was enormous, because the industry was enormous. At its peak in the 1880s, Cheshire was producing over 2 million tons of salt per year, feeding the chemical industry as well as the food industry. Salt by this point was not just for preserving meat and fish. It was a raw material for producing chlorine, for making soda ash, for dozens of industrial chemical processes. The Industrial Revolution had found a new use for salt, and the ground beneath Cheshire paid for it. Inside the salt works themselves, the work was done by men called lumpers. The name came from the lumps of salt they cut and carried. Their job was to stand at the edge of the open evaporation pans and rake the salt crystals that had formed on the surface and bottom of the hot brine, drawing the crystals toward them, shaping them into mounds, and then cutting those mounds into blocks with long-handed tools and stacking the blocks on wooden shelves to dry. The pans were heated from below by coal fires. This meant that the space around them was hot, very hot, not the dry heat of a desert. A wet, dense mineral heat, steam rising from the surface of the brine, salt coating every surface, the tools, the walls, the ceiling above, the clothes of the men working them. Salt deposited on everything it touched. A lumper working a 12-hour shift would be coated in it by the end. His boots, his jacket, his hair. The salt pulled moisture from his skin. Men who worked the pans for years developed skin that cracked at the joints, hands and wrists that split open in dry weather. They wrapped their hands in rags when they could get them. The work was hard in a simple physical sense. Raking and cutting and lifting blocks of wet salt is heavy work. The blocks had to be moved from the pan to the drying shelves, and from the drying shelves to the storage areas, and some storage to the barges on the river, always carried by hand, or balanced on a wooden yoke across the shoulders. A full block of salt weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms. Men moved dozens of them in a shift. The pay was low. Most lumpers were paid not by the hour, but by the amount of salt they produced. The piece rate, which meant that slower work or thinner brine or cooler fires meant less money at the end of the week. Variables the worker had no control over. If the coal ran short and the fires burned cooler, the brine took longer to crystallize. Slower crystallization meant less salt per shift. Less salt meant less pay. The risk of natural variation was passed entirely to the men doing the work. Children worked in the salt houses too, not at the pans, which were too dangerous for small children, but in the storage areas and on the barges, filling sacks, loading cargo, doing the smaller tasks around the edges of production. Factory inspection records from the mid-19th century include descriptions of children as young as 8 working regular hours at Cheshire salt works. This was not unusual for the era, but it was part of what the industrial salt industry looked like from the inside, away from the ledgers and the canal accounts and the shipping manifests. The Lion Salt Works at Marston, near Northwich, ran open pan production until 1986, over 100 years of continuous operation in the same buildings. Generation after generation of families from the same Cheshire villages working the same pans. The technology changed slowly and not very much. The coal fires became gas fires. Some of the lifting was mechanized, but the raking and the cutting and the stacking were still done by hand on the day the works finally closed. The same motions as the Roman workers at the brine springs 2,000 years before. Different scale, different tools, the same heat above the brine, the same salt coating on the arms and the face at the end of a shift. Some things in this story change very slowly. The Industrial Revolution changed the volume and the speed of salt production. It did not change what it felt like to stand at the edge of a hot pan and rake salt crystals toward you for 12 hours. On the other side of the world from Cheshire, the British Empire was doing something that had been done by empires with salt since the very beginning. It was using salt as a mechanism of control. India, under British rule, was one of the largest producers of salt in the world. The subcontinent has a long coastline. It has salt lakes in the interior. It has flat coastal plains ideal for evaporation pans. For thousands of years before the British arrived, Indians had made salt from the sea and the land and lived alongside it as a basic fact of existence. Salt was everywhere, and it was cheap. The British changed that. As British control over India solidified through the 18th and 19th centuries, the administration began to regulate salt production and sale. The logic was simple. Salt is something every person must consume, rich or poor, city or village, young or old. If you can control the salt supply and tax it, you have a revenue stream that reaches everyone in the territory. The British Salt Act of 1882 formalized what had been building for decades. Under this law, it became illegal in British India to produce, possess, or sell salt without authorization from the colonial government. Only government-licensed salt could be traded legally, and government salt carried a tax. The salt tax was not enormous in absolute terms, a few annas per mond, small numbers, but for a family living on very little, that few annas mattered. And the principle behind it mattered far more than the amount, because salt was not a luxury. It was not something you could decide not to buy to avoid the tax. Your body required it, especially in the heat of the Indian climate, where people sweated through long working days in the fields and lost sodium continuously. The salt tax was a tax on survival itself. It was also, and this is what made it politically extraordinary, a tax on something that was available for free. On the beaches of India's enormous coastline, the sea deposited salt every time the tide came in and the sun dried the flats. You could look at it from the shore, white crystals on the sand, free, provided by the ocean, by the sun, by geography. And under the law of 1882, it was illegal for an Indian person to pick it up. Collecting naturally occurring salt from the coast was a criminal act. This was the system as it stood in early 1930, when a 70-year-old man in a white cloth, sitting in an ashram outside the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, decided that the salt tax would be the place where the argument against British rule would be made visible. And he had spent years thinking about how to challenge the empire, not with violence, but with a form of refusal that anyone could understand and participate in. He needed something that was at once legal and illegal, practical and symbolic, something that would make the absurdity of colonial law clear to every person who heard about it. Salt was the answer. He wrote to the Viceroy of India, Lord Irwin, on March 2, 1930. He explained what he intended to do. He would walk to the coast, he would pick up salt, and by doing so he would break the law. He gave the Viceroy 11 days to respond. The Viceroy's secretary replied on his behalf. The Viceroy regretted that Mr. Gandhi intended to break the law, and that was all. Gandhi sent his acknowledgement, and on March 12, 1930, he walked out of the Sabarmati ashram and began to move south toward the sea. He began with 78 followers. Men from the ashram, people who had trained with him, who understood what he was doing and why. They carried their own food. They slept in fields and in village courtyards along the way. They did not travel fast. Gandhi was not young. He was 60 years old. He walked with a bamboo staff. He had been thin for decades, but he walked every day without stopping. The route was 241 miles. Through the flat agricultural land of Gujarat, through villages, along dirt roads, across dry river bends. The target was a small coastal settlement called Dandi, on the shore of the Arabian Sea. The march took 24 days, and as it went on, it changed in scale completely. At the start, 78 people. By the time the column entered the first villages, hundreds had joined. By the time it had been walking for a week, thousands lined the road to watch and to join. The press was following it, not just the Indian press. The British newspapers, the American newspapers. Time magazine ran Gandhi on its cover. The whole world was watching a 70-year-old man walk very slowly through the dust of Gujarat toward the sea. In each village that the march passed through, Gandhi stopped and spoke. He was not asking people to fight. He was not asking anyone to pick up a weapon. He was asking people to refuse, to stop paying the salt tax, to stop buying government salt, to make their own. This was the practice known as satyagraha, a Sanskrit word that translates roughly as truth force or soul force. The idea that moral pressure applied through visible refusal could accomplish what violence could not, because violence gave the empire a reason to respond with violence, which it was better equipped for. But a man walking quietly to the sea to pick up salt was something different, something the empire had no prepared answer to. The British authorities watched the march and debated what to do. Arresting Gandhi before he reached the coast would make him a martyr and accelerate the movement. Letting him walk freely would allow the act to complete itself. They chose to let him walk, which was also the wrong choice. There was no right choice. The march arrived at the village of Dandi on the morning of April 5, 1930. Gandhi and his followers had walked for 24 days. They camped overnight on the beach. The next morning, April 6th, Gandhi rose before dawn and prayed. He walked to the shoreline as the sun came up. He bent down, and he picked up a small lump of salt crust from the mud at the water's edge. That was the act, a man picking up a small white lump from the ground at the edge of the sea. Something a child could do in 30 seconds. Illegal under British law. Photographed by every press photographer in the crowd that had gathered. Seen by the world, he held it up briefly. He said nothing that the crowd could hear. And then the act spread across the entire coastline of India. In the days that followed, ordinary people walked to the nearest beach or salt flat and picked up salt. Millions of acts of the same quiet refusal. The British arrested over 60,000 people in the following months, which created 60,000 symbols, and changed nothing about the fact that the salt was still there on the beach, free, waiting. People asked at the time, including people who supported Indian independence, why salt? Of all the grievances against British rule, of which there were many, why choose the salt tax as the place to make the stand? The answer was in the nature of salt itself. Every argument Gandhi had made against British rule over the preceding decades was complicated. It involved land rights and legal systems, and economic structures in the history of colonial administration. Important things, true things, but difficult things. Things that required education and context and the ability to read and compare documents. Salt required none of that. Salt was on the table at every meal eaten by every person in India, regardless of whether they had land or money or education. Salt was in the body of every person working in the heat, or not in the body, if they could not afford to replace what they lost through sweat. The salt tax touched everyone, equally. A landlord and a landless laborer paid the same salt tax because their bodies needed the same amount of sodium. There was no way to escape it by being rich or poor or by living in a particular region. You ate salt, you paid, and the thing you paid for was lying free on the ground within walking distance of the coastline. That gap, between what was free and what was taxed, between the sea's gift and the empire's toll, was something that did not require explanation. A grandmother in a village who had never heard a political speech understood it the moment it was named. A farmer who had never read a newspaper understood it. A child understood it. The salt tax said, "We will stand between you and the earth you live on, and take a portion of what you need to live." And Gandhi said, "Walk with me to the sea and pick it up yourself." The genius of the choice was that the act of resistance was indistinguishable from ordinary human behavior. Picking up salt from a beach is not a revolutionary gesture in any physical sense. It is almost invisible. But it declared in the simplest possible terms that the empire did not own the ground or the sea or the minerals they produced, and that a law saying otherwise was not a real law, but a fiction maintained by force. The Salt March did not end British rule in India immediately. Independence did not come until 1947, 17 years later. And the path from the beach at Dundee to the formal partition of the subcontinent was long and painful and complicated. But historians who have studied the independence movement are consistent in one assessment. The Salt March was the moment that something changed permanently in the psychology of both sides. Before April 1930, many Indians believed on some level that British rule was legitimate, or at least that it was too powerful to challenge in practice. After the march, both of those things were harder to believe. The image of a 70-year-old man bending down to pick up a handful of salt that the most powerful empire in the world had told him he was not allowed to touch, had done something that armies and arguments had not done. It had made the empire look ridiculous and afraid, because 60,000 arrests in response to people picking up salt from beaches is not the behavior of a confident authority. It is the behavior of a system that knows it cannot justify itself clearly, and that once an idea is visible, once the gap between the salt on the ground and the tax on the salt has been named and walked toward publicly, it is very difficult to unsee. Salt had been used for thousands of years as a tool of state control, taxed by pharaohs, monopolized by emperors, moved along roads built specifically to collect revenue from it. In 1930, salt was used to dismantle a state, the same mineral, the same human need, turned in a different direction. 30 years before Gandhi walked to Dundee, and on a different continent entirely, a war had demonstrated something that every army commander in history had understood, but that rarely got discussed in the accounts of battles and strategies. Armies run on salt, not on courage or tactics or the quality of their weapons alone, on salt. Because without salt, armies cannot eat. Not properly, not for weeks at a time in the field. In the middle of the 19th century, before refrigeration, before canning on a large scale, before any of the food preservation technologies that would arrive later, salt was the only reliable way to stop meat and fish from spoiling. Pack beef in salt, it lasts for months. Pack it without salt, it is inedible within days. An army moving through territory with no salt supply is an army that runs out of food, not immediately, but inexorably. which is why when the American Civil War began in 1861, the Confederate States immediately understood that their salt supply was a military problem. The Confederate South was not naturally well supplied with salt. Much of the South's salt before the war had come from the North or had been imported by ship. The northern blockade of Confederate ports, which the Union Navy established early in the war, cut off the imported salt almost immediately, and the political separation from the northern states cut off the domestic supply. The Confederacy was suddenly operating as a separate country that had almost no salt of its own, and it needed enormous quantities, not just for its armies, but for its civilian population too, for the pork and beef that were the foundation of the Southern diet, for the fish caught in Southern rivers, for the cattle hides that had to be preserved for leather goods. Salt shortages in the Confederacy produced panic within months of the war's beginning. The price of salt rose by a factor of 50 in some parts of the South in the first 2 years of the war. Salt riots broke out in several Confederate cities, women marching through the streets demanding that the government release salt from military stores to civilians. The Confederate government scrambled to find sources. Salt works were established along the Gulf Coast of Florida, boiling seawater in large kettles. These coastal salt works were small and vulnerable. The Union Navy targeted them specifically, ships shelling the kettles, landing parties destroying the evaporation equipment. The Confederacy needed something more reliable and harder to destroy than a beach operation, and in the mountains of Western Virginia, in a valley called Saltville, they had it. Saltville sat in a deep valley in what is now southwestern Virginia. The valley had salt springs that had been worked since before European settlement. Native American peoples had used the salt licks in Saltville for thousands of years. Early European settlers had built small salt works there in the late 18th century. By the time the Civil War began, Saltville had developed into the largest inland salt production facility in the Confederate States. At its peak, it was producing close to 4 million pounds of salt per year, shipped out on a single narrow-gauge railroad that connected the valley to the broader Confederate supply network. 4 million pounds of salt per year, moving along one small railway line through the mountains. This made Saltville's importance very clear, and it made the railroad that connected it equally important. The Union understood this. Military planners in Washington understood that destroying the Saltville works or cutting the rail connection would create a salt shortage that would spread through the Confederate Army's ability to feed itself. Salt was a military target, the same way a bridge is a target, or a supply depot, or an ammunition store. Destroy the source and the army dependent on it weakens. The first major Union attempt to destroy the salt works at Saltville came in October 1864. Brigadier General Stephen Burbridge led a force of roughly 5,000 cavalry south through Kentucky and into southwestern Virginia. The goal was straightforward: reach Saltville, destroy the salt works, and withdraw. The problem was the terrain. The valley where Saltville sat was accessible through only a few mountain passes, and the Confederates knew those passes and had men in them. Burbridge's force reached the approaches to Saltville on October 2nd, 1864. They encountered Confederate defenders dug into the slopes above the valley. The fighting lasted much of the day. The Union cavalry could not dislodge the defenders. They could not reach the salt works below. By nightfall, with casualties mounting and no way forward, Burbridge ordered his men to pull back. The salt works were untouched. Production continued. The kettles kept boiling. The second attempt came in December of the same year, this time led by General George Stoneman. Stoneman came with a larger force and a different approach. He did not try to reach Saltville through the frontal passes. He approached from a different direction, through different terrain, with the element of surprise. The December raid succeeded. Stoneman's men reached Saltville on December 20th, 1864. The Confederate defenders were overwhelmed. The Union troops moved into the valley, and they destroyed the salt works. Methodically, the large boiling kettles were broken. The furnaces were torn apart. The storage buildings were burned. The mechanical equipment used to pump brine from the wells was wrecked. The narrow-gauge railroad that carried the salt out was torn up for a significant distance, in both directions. The operation took several days. When Stoneman's men finally withdrew, the Saltville salt works had been effectively destroyed. It was December 1864. The war would continue for another 4 months. And for those 4 months, the Confederacy had lost its most important inland salt source. The effect on Confederate food preservation was immediate and severe. Reports from Confederate supply officers in early 1865 described salt shortages throughout the army. Meat that could not be preserved was lost. Rations were reduced. Men who were already eating less than they needed ate less still. This is not what ended the Confederacy. The war had many causes and many turning points, and the salt works at Saltville was one factor among many, but it was a factor, and it illustrates something about how wars are actually sustained, not just by weapons and men, but by the long supply chains behind the weapons and men. The food that kept soldiers able to fight, the salt that preserved the food, the mines and salt works and coastal kettles that produced the salt, the rails and roads that moved it. A war is not just the line where the armies meet. It is everything behind that line. And for an agrarian society in the mid-19th century, fighting an industrial war across hundreds of miles of contested territory, the thing behind the line that mattered most was food, and the thing that made food possible over long campaigns was salt, as it had been for armies since the earliest campaigns of which we have any record. Roman legions moving through hostile territory carried salt rations. Medieval armies preserved their provisions in salt for the march. The Saltville raids in 1864 were the same logic as every army that had ever understood the relationship between salt and the capacity to fight. Control the salt, and you control the endurance of whatever depends on it. By the end of the 19th century, salt had become something slightly different from what it had always been. Not less important, different. For most of human history, the difficulty of getting salt was the central fact about it. The distance to the nearest source, the cost of transporting it, the question of who controlled it and what they charged for it. These were the forces that shaped cities and roads and empires and trade routes and wars. But during the 19th century, industrial production changed the equation. The Cheshire brine pumps, producing 2 million tons per year. The development of vacuum evaporation technology that could produce pure salt cheaply and in enormous quantities. The railroad networks that could move salt from wherever it was produced to wherever it was needed in days rather than months. Salt became ordinary, common, cheap, a thing you bought in a bag from a market stall for almost nothing. The strategic value of controlling salt routes did not entirely disappear. The Civil War had demonstrated that even in the industrial age, armies still needed salt and could be hurt by losing access to it. But the days when a city could be built on nothing but salt taxation, when a caravan could make its operators rich by crossing a desert with salt slabs on the backs of camels, when an emperor's grip on the salt monopoly was the foundation of state revenue, those days were ending. What they left behind was the shape of things. Roads built to move salt that are still roads. Cities that exist because they sat on a salt source or at a crossing point between salt and the people who needed it. Legal and administrative systems built to tax and control salt that became templates for taxing and controlling everything else. The infrastructure of salt persisted long after salt stopped being scarce. The Via Salaria in Italy, the old salt road out of Rome, is still a road. People drive on it without knowing what it was for. The Cheshire canals built to move salt to the coast became part of the industrial transportation network for every other good that needed moving. The Chinese Salt Administration, the bureaucratic model built around managing the salt monopoly, survived for over 2,000 years and shaped every other administrative structure the Chinese state developed. Salt trails become trade routes. Trade routes become roads. Roads collect settlements. Settlements become towns. Towns become cities. And the reason for the trail at the beginning, the salt, the mineral need, the biological dependency, gets built over and forgotten. The city does not remember why it is where it is. And people live in it without knowing that the reason their grandparents' settled in this valley rather than that one was a salt spring, or the proximity to a caravan route, or the decision of a Roman engineer about where to route a road carrying salt from the coast. History works this way with most things. The original reason is buried under what the reason made possible. But salt is one of the more visible examples. Because salt is so fundamental. Because the need for it is so universal. Because it appears at every scale of human organization. In the body of one person sweating in a field. In the account books of the largest empire that ever existed. In the decision of an old man walking slowly to the sea. In the orders of a Union general deciding which salt works to destroy before winter. It is the same mineral each time, the same compound. Sodium and chlorine, bonded together. White, crystalline, necessary, the oldest trade, the first tax. Still dissolving quietly into everything around it, salt production never stopped. Through every century covered in this video, it simply changed form. The method changed. The scale changed. The location of the largest operations shifted from one part of the world to another. But somewhere, always, people were cutting salt or boiling brine or raking crystals from a shallow pan. Today, the world produces roughly 300 million tons of salt per year. That number is difficult to hold in the mind. 300 million tons. Most of it is not for eating. Only about 6% of the salt produced each year goes into food. The rest goes into chemistry, into road de-icing, into water treatment, into the production of chlorine and sodium compounds that become plastics, paper, glass, and hundreds of other materials. Salt became an industrial chemical in the 19th century, and it has been one ever since. The same mineral that paid Roman soldiers and built the camel routes across the Sahara is now being processed into the raw materials for plastic containers and water softeners and the bleach that keeps hospitals clean. Its presence is everywhere and almost invisible, because we are not in the habit of thinking about where industrial chemicals come from or what they were before they became industrial. The places where salt is still extracted are worth thinking about for a moment. The Wieliczka mine in Poland is still open. Not for salt production. The industrial extraction ended in 1996, but the mine is still there. The chapels carved from salt are still there. The underground lake is still there. The tunnels that the 14th century miners walked through, cutting salt from the walls by lamplight, are still passable. About 1.5 million people visit the mine each year now. They descend into the same darkness that the miners descended into for 700 years. The air has the same mineral quality, heavy and slightly cool. The walls still glitter if you hold a light close to them, not because anything has been added, because the salt itself reflects light. The Dead Sea, in the Middle East, is still evaporating. It has been shrinking for decades because the rivers that feed it have been diverted for agriculture, and the water taken from it is not being replaced at the same rate as it leaves. But the southern basin, the shallow end of the sea, is still worked commercially. Israeli and Jordanian companies on opposite shores pump the remaining water into evaporation pans. The mineral-rich brine dries in the desert sun. Potassium, magnesium, bromine, all extracted from what the evaporation leaves behind. The same process as the Egyptian salt pans 4,000 years ago. Sun, water, time. Except now conducted at industrial scale between two countries that have been at war with each other for most of the past century. The Cheshire salt fields are still producing. British Salt, based in Middlewich, still pumps brine from the underground deposits below the Cheshire Plain and evaporates it in large vacuum pans. The brine springs that the Romans used are long exhausted, but the deep rock salt deposits the Romans never reached are still there, still being dissolved, still being pumped up. The ground above is no longer sinking at the rate it was in the 19th century because the wild brine pumping was eventually regulated. The old flashes, the subsidence lakes in the fields, have largely stabilized. They have developed their own ecosystems. Waterfowl, nesting on the reeds at their edges, fish in the water, a kind of nature that grew into the absence left by extraction, life finding a way into the spaces that industry opened. Salt production did not end. It became routine, and routine things disappear from view. The human body has not changed its requirements. In all the time covered by this history, from the animal salt licks followed by early humans, to the brine pumps of industrial Cheshire, to the present moment, the body's need for sodium has remained essentially unchanged. About 2 grams of sodium per day, more in heat, more when you sweat through long physical work, less if you are resting in a cool place, but roughly 2 grams, every day without exception. The body does not store large reserves of sodium the way it stores fat or certain vitamins. It holds what it needs and loses the rest through sweat and urine, and then it needs to replace what it lost. This cycle has been running since before there were human beings. Every vertebrate on the planet operates on the same basic sodium chemistry. Fish in the ocean, mammals on land, birds crossing continents, all of them managing internal sodium levels through the same ancient biological mechanisms. The ocean is where that chemistry began. The first life evolved in salt water, and the internal chemistry of living cells still carries that origin inside it. The fluid inside your cells and the fluid around them maintains a salt concentration that is remarkably similar to the concentration of a very ancient ocean, not the modern ocean, which is saltier than it was in the deep past, something older. The chemistry of life was set when the ocean was a certain salinity, and life has been maintaining that internal ratio ever since. You are carrying a small enclosed sample of an ancient sea inside you. This is not a metaphor, it is a description of your blood. Right now, as you are listening to this, sodium ions are moving in and out of the cells in your nervous system, creating the electrical signals that make hearing possible. The sound of this narration reaches you because sodium is crossing cell membranes in your ears and your brain. The processing of every word is a sodium event. There is no way to separate yourself from this mineral. You are made partly of it. You think with it. You hear with it. The same 2-gram daily requirement that drove early humans towards salt licks is the same requirement running in you tonight, managed effortlessly by a body that has been solving this particular problem for hundreds of millions of years, so effortlessly that you do not think about it at all. You salt your food without thinking about why. The craving guides you, the same way it guided the deer to the rock, the same way it guided the first people toward the wet patch of ground at the edge of a dry riverbed. The surface changes, the restaurant table instead of the riverbank, the glass shaker instead of the lick of bare stone. But the signal underneath is identical, the same very quiet pull that has been moving living things towards salt since before the first human foot left the first print in the first mud. All of the history in this video, all of the roads and empires and trade routes and taxes and wars, can be understood as a very large and very complicated answer to a very small and very simple biological signal. The body says it needs salt, and for 200,000 years of human history, everyone has been fighting a way to answer that, building the world around the attempt. There are salt flats in many parts of the world that have not been touched by extraction. Places where the salt has simply accumulated for thousands of years and stayed. The Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia is the largest. Over 10,000 square kilometers of salt crust on a high plateau in the Andes, at an elevation of about 3,600 meters above sea level. The remains of a prehistoric lake that dried out 10 to 40,000 years ago. What it left behind is a flat of salt that in places is 10 meters thick, hard at the surface in the dry season, covered by a thin mirror of water in the wet season, which turns the sky into a reflection so precise that the horizon disappears. Above and below become indistinguishable. An expanse of sky in every direction with the horizon gone. Photographs of it look like images from a different planet. But it is an ordinary consequence of salt and water and flat ground and light. Very early in the morning on the Salar, before the sun is fully up, the salt surface holds the cold of the high-altitude night. The air is very still. If there is no wind, and often there is not at that hour, the silence is complete. There is nothing to hear except the sound of your own breathing, and the faint sound of the salt itself, which is almost no sound at all. Just the very slight crunch of crystals under your feet if you move. The surface is white. Not a brilliant white, something softer. The white of something that has been lying in sunlight and wind and cold for 10,000 years. Worn slightly smooth at the surface. Faintly gray in the places where wind has deposited a little dust. The taste of it, if you press a finger to the surface and then touch the finger to your tongue, is the taste of the sea. Not a particular sea, the sea in the general sense. That mineral heaviness at the back of the palate, salt and something beyond salt that does not have a word. The Salar has been there for thousands of years, and will be there for thousands more. Its salt is not going anywhere on its own. It is simply lying there in the thin air of the Andes, accumulating nothing and losing nothing, waiting the way minerals wait, without urgency, without awareness. There are places in the world where you can stand at the edge of the longest story in human history and not know it. Where the oldest human appetite and the oldest human trade good is simply lying underfoot, undisturbed, not yet part of anyone's road or anyone's war or anyone's empire. Just salt, on the ground, in the cold morning light. Before anything happens to it, the whole history of what salt becomes when humans find it is invisible at that moment. And the pale sky coming in from the east, and the white surface holding the last of the night's cold, and the silence, which is very complete and very old. One of the places salt left the deepest mark is in language. Words that are used every day in dozens of languages that carry salt inside them without anyone noticing. The word salary, which was covered earlier in this video in relation to Rome, is the most famous example. But it is far from the only one. The Latin word for salt was sal. That root traveled into dozens of European languages and became embedded in words that have nothing obvious to do with salt anymore. Sauce is one. The word sauce comes from the Latin salsa, which meant salted. The original sauces of ancient Rome were not complicated preparations. They were salted liquids used to preserve or season food. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way people in Southeast Asia use fish sauce today, was salted liquid. Every sauce you have ever eaten carries in its name a record of that origin. Salsa, in Spanish, is the same word. It means salted. Salami is the same root, salted meat. The word sausage is from the Old French sausage, from the Latin salsis, salted. The word salad comes from the Latin herba salata, salted vegetables. Romans ate raw vegetables dressed with brine, which became vinaigrette over the centuries, but the name still carries the salt at its core. Ocean, in some interpretations, traces to a Proto-Indo-European root meaning salt water. The word hal, in many Germanic and Celtic languages, meant both salt and sea. Halogen, the chemical family that includes chlorine, fluorine, iodine, is named from the Greek for salt producing. Because these elements combine with metals to form salts, the chemistry of the periodic table holds the salt root inside it. None of this is coincidence. Salt was so central to daily life for so long that the language wrapped around it. The words for preserving, for flavoring, for the sea, for certain payments, for specific foods, all of them shaped by the same mineral. The process works this way with anything that matters enough for long enough. The thing eventually gets inside the language, into the roots and the compounds and the idioms. English still uses the phrase to take something with a grain of salt, meaning to approach it skeptically. The phrase comes from the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who wrote about an antidote to poison that was to be taken with a grain of salt, 2,000 years ago. Still in the language today, rephrased, reused, slightly changed in meaning, but still there. A person worth their salt means a person of value. Again from the Roman salary connection, salt being what value was measured in. Below the salt, in medieval English usage, meant of low social standing. At large feasts, the salt cellar, an often elaborate container holding the table salt, was placed in the middle of the table. The important guest sat above it, closer to the host. The lesser guest sat below it, further away. Your position relative to the salt was your position in the room. Salt organized society at the dinner table the same way it organized empires across continents. Always at the center, always marking who had access and who did not. The language holds all of this quietly, in words so ordinary that no one stops to ask where they came from. Sauce, salary, salad. Each one a small door into a room that has been there for a very long time. Place names carry the salt record too. Across Europe particularly, and in parts of the Middle East and Central Asia. Many of the oldest towns and cities have names that were given to them because of the salt nearby. In German, the word for salt is Salz. Salzburg, the city of Salzburg in Austria, sits at the foot of a mountain range that contains some of the oldest salt mines in the world. The mines at Hallstatt, a short distance from Salzburg, have been worked continuously for over 7,000 years. This makes them among the oldest continuously operated mines of any kind in human history. The name Hallstatt comes from the Celtic words for salt and place, a salt place. The entire early Iron Age period in European archaeology is named after this village, the Hallstatt culture, because archaeologists found the richest and most characteristic remains of that era in the cemeteries around Hallstatt. The people buried there were wealthy because of the salt. So the name of an entire period of European prehistory is, at its root, the word for salt and the word for place, a salt place. Hall, in the same Germanic and Celtic root, also means salt. Halle, in Germany, Hallein in Austria, Schwäbisch Hall in southern Germany, all named for salt, all built near salt sources that are now centuries past their productive peak. The cities are still there, substantial, inhabited, ancient, but the salt that named them is gone or depleted or worked out long ago. The name remains as the only surviving record of why anyone settled there in the first place. Moselle, the the river in France and Germany, may derive from a root meaning salty water. There were salt works on its banks in Roman times. The river's name may be the oldest piece of evidence for something people did along its banks 2,000 years ago. In England, beyond the witch names in Cheshire, there are place names containing the element salt throughout the country. Saltash in Cornwall, Saltburn in Yorkshire, Saltfleet in Lincolnshire, Salthouse in Norfolk, which sits on the coast near tidal marshes that were salted commercially in medieval times. Salt Road, in various forms, appears as a street name in dozens of English towns, usually on a route that salt carts once traveled. The carts are gone. The road is still called Salt Road. In the Middle East, the Jordan Valley contains a town called As-Salt, in what is now Jordan. Its name records the salt deposits in the surrounding limestone hills. In Poland, Wieliczka, the salt mine town, takes its name from the Polish Wielki, meaning great, combined with the salt association of the valley it sits in. In Ethiopia, the Danakil Depression, one of the hottest and lowest places on the surface of the earth, has been mined for salt by the Afar people for centuries. The place names of the depression mark the locations of the salt lakes and the trading routes that ran from them into the Ethiopian highlands. These names predate written records in the region. They are themselves the record. The name tells you what was there and why people came. Long before anyone wrote anything down about it, people settled near salt and named the place for what they found. And then centuries later, the name outlasted everything else. The salt, the industry, the original reason, all of it gone except the sound of the word. Hallstatt, Salzburg, Northwich, words that still carry salt in their mouths. Salt persisted in ritual long after it stopped being scarce. This is one of the most consistent features of how humans relate to things they once depended on completely. The dependence fades as supply increases, but the reverence takes much longer to leave. In the Catholic Church, salt was used in the rite of baptism for most of the Church's history. A few grains of salt were placed on the tongue of the person being baptized. The precise meaning of the gesture was explained in various ways by different theologians. Preservation against corruption, wisdom, covenant. The Hebrew Bible uses the phrase covenant of salt to describe agreements of permanent and binding nature. Salt does not rot. Salt preserves against rot. A covenant of salt was a covenant that could not decay. Numbers 18 in the Hebrew text instructs that offerings to God must be seasoned with salt, that all offerings of grain brought to the temple were to have salt added. The altar was salted. The sacrifice was salted. The logic behind this was not stated directly but runs through the same understanding. Salt is incorruptible. What is brought before God should share that quality. In Islamic tradition, salt appears at the beginning and end of meals in certain cultures, eaten first to purify the palate and last to close the meal. This practice is documented in Hadith literature and traces back to early Islamic scholarship that saw salt as a protective and purifying substance. In Shinto ritual in Japan, salt is placed at the corners of a sumo wrestling ring before a match to purify the ground. Handfuls of salt thrown onto the clay before two wrestlers enter, driving away impurity from the space where the contest will happen. Salt still poured for the same reason it was poured in shrines across the ancient world, because it does not change, because it stays itself. In Mexican tradition, salt is placed on the ofrenda during Dia de los Muertos alongside food and water. The salt purifies the soul of the dead person on their journey. The same logic as Egypt, the same logic as Rome. Salt is the thing you take with you across the threshold between states, because it crosses without changing. None of these rituals require salt to be expensive or rare. In every one of these cultures, salt is cheap and easy to obtain by the time the ritual is documented. The reverence stayed, detached from the scarcity, running on its own momentum. This is how all things persist in human culture. Not because the original reason still applies, but because the form of the thing becomes its own reason over enough time. The gesture outlives its logic, the word outlives its referent, the ritual outlives its necessity, and salt, which was once the most necessary thing in the world, is now everywhere at once and costs almost nothing, but people still speak of being worth their salt, still place it at the center of the table, still pour it over a shoulder for luck, still season every meal, every offering, every effort at preservation with it, without thinking about why, the way you do most things that are so old they have become instinct, older than the reason for them, older than memory. The story does not end because the thing that drove it is everywhere now. Stories do not end that way. They end because the telling reaches a natural place to rest. And the natural place to rest with salt is somewhere close to where we started, before the roads, before the empires, before the caravans and the mines and the tax records and the wars, before any of it was organized or named. The salt was already there, in the ground, in the water, in the air near the sea. It was there before there were humans to want it, before there were animals to find the licks and wear the stones smooth with their tongues. Salt is older than life on this planet. The mineral itself, the compound, sodium bonded to chlorine, was here before anything breathed. When the first oceans formed, they were salt water. When the first cells divided in those oceans, they divided in salt solution. When the first living things crawled out of the water and survived on land, they carried the salt water inside them, in the fluid of their cells, in the chemistry that let them move and think and want. Everything that came after was an elaboration of that first dependency. The dependency was set in the ocean before there were words for anything, before there was anything to want. The wanting came with the life, and the life came from the salt solution of an ancient sea. What that means for all the history that followed is something like this. The trade routes were not about salt at the deepest level. They were about the ocean, about what the ocean put inside the body before the body ever left the water. The empires that taxed salt were taxing something that the body could not negotiate its way out of meeting, which is why salt taxes work and why they produce resentment. Because taxing a biological necessity is experienced differently from taxing a luxury. It is felt differently, in the body, not just in the account book. Gandhi understood this. The miners at Wieliczka understood it without needing to frame it. The camel drivers crossing the Sahara understood it in the way you understand something when your life depends on it. Salt is not a commodity at the deepest level. It is a condition of being alive, and everything built around it, every road, every empire, every mine shaft, every political act, was built around that fact, the oldest fact there is, older than agriculture, older than language, older than fire. The body needs salt. It has always needed salt. It will always need salt. And around that single unmoving fact, the entire human world arranged itself, with more complexity than anyone intended, and more consequence than anyone foresaw. The rest is everything that happened. It is early. Before the light is full, somewhere flat, near water, the ground is pale. The white crust at the edge of the pool, the same crust that has been there since before anyone came to look at it. The sun draws the water out of the shallow basin over the course of the day. Slowly, the way the sun always does, and what is left behind when the water is gone is the mineral. Not a gift, not a resource, just the consequence of water leaving. Salt is what remains when the water goes. That is its simplest definition. What remains? The residue of something that moved on. There is a quality to that early light on a salt flat that is hard to name. The white of the crust is not clean. It has the texture of old things, slightly rough, slightly uneven, cracked in places where the surface has contracted in the cold. The cracks run in irregular patterns, the way old ceramic cracks, the way drought-dry mud cracks. Along the lines of least resistance, wherever the surface gave first, the air around a salt flat carries the mineral in it. You can taste it before you taste anything else in the morning air. Salt and cold and the faint smell of the water that evaporated the day before, an absence that left a smell behind it. The pool is still there at the center. What is left of it? A shallow lens of water, reflecting the pale pre-dawn above, perfectly still. The stillness that comes before anything moves, before the birds begin, before the temperature shifts and the air starts to stir. In that stillness, the water looks like something solid, like a mirror someone left here, in the flat place, and forgot. Around the edge of the water, the white crust is thickest, where the water has been receding, day by day, season by season, leaving a ring of salt at each waterline, the way a tide leaves its mark on a beach. The rings go outward from the current water's edge, each ring a record of where the water was, how much there was, how far it reached before it receded. The salt holds the record of the water's movements, in the white lines at the edge of the dry ground, a history written in mineral, without ink, without language, without anyone to write it or read it. It is simply there, at the edge of the pool, in the pale light, before the day begins. The crust does not know it is the oldest substance in human history. It does not know anything. It simply is what it is, the residue, the remainder, what the water left when it could not stay. The light is growing now, slowly, the way light always grows in flat, open places, without drama, without announcement. It simply becomes easier to see. The white of the salt catches the first light before anything else does, because it reflects, because it was always reflecting. What is in the air here is old, older than the name for it, older than the idea of naming. The mineral does not change with the light. The mineral does not change at all. It is not the kind of thing that changes. Sodium, chlorine, bonded. Since before anything on this surface wanted them. The wanting came later. Everything came later. The roads, the mines, the caravans crossing the long desert, the salt slabs on the backs of camels, the underground chapels, the boiling pans, the men standing at the edge of them, arms white with residue at the end of a shift. The old man walking slowly in the dust, 24 days, toward the sea, the salt cellar at the center of the table, the mountain with the name that means Salt City, the underground lake 1,000 feet below the surface, the white rings at the edge of the retreating pool. All of it came from one thing, a need the body cannot negotiate, a signal, very quiet, very old, that said, find salt, and everything that happened, happened. The sun is coming up now, at the edge of the pool. The water catches it, holds it briefly. The white crust at the waterline, still there. The birds begin somewhere off to the left. One call, then another. The air starting to move, very slightly. The smell of the water, the mineral underneath the morning, the flat ground, the pale sky getting lighter, the salt at the edge of what remains, waiting, the way it always has, without hurry, without knowledge of itself, just there, white, in the morning, at the edge of the water, where it has always been,